All right. Good afternoon, everybody. I am making this video in reference to a question by Bados Rob, or to Rob, I don't know, Batus Rob, I don't know, Bados Rob. He asked, excuse me, if it's true that many liberal Jews are lax in their belief in God. And he comments that you hear a lot about this in the scientific and academic community. What I assume he's talking about is a lack of belief in God. I wouldn't even consider it laxity in belief in God as much as a lack of a belief in God. It's not like they feel like, oh, we should be doing this, but we're being lax about it. It's something that's maybe not even on their radar. And the question is, as far as liberal Jews, if that's the same as it is in much of the academic and scientific community. Now, I can't really speak for other people. I'm not a liberal Jew. I consider myself what we're calling today a classical liberal as far as government is concerned, and a pretty right-wing conservative in my religious views, I would say. And although what we call today in America classical is the American right for the most part today, that there is not so much of a, today's American right really has abandoned the progressivist ideology of us telling you what to do, and it's just turned more or less to like, when it comes to government, we don't tell you what to do, but you don't tell us what to do. And as I demonstrated with this video here, the comment was on a video called "How Liberal Are Liberal Jews?", pointing out that essentially left-wing Jews are not very liberal in the classical liberal sense. They are not very tolerant of people who have different views than they do, as is mostly the case on the left, and mostly in general the case with what we call the progressive movement, which is probably a misnomer. It's probably more regressive than anything. Putting all that aside, that's not really the question, but it is the answer, But there are many things we can discuss as far as this question about belief in God, which probably is going to be not really the answer that's being sought here. But then again, we also have to question who are liberal Jews? What does it mean to be a liberal Jew? How Jewish do you have to be to fit into this question? Meaning, to me, as a religious Jew, Judaism is first and foremost a religion, not a race, not a nation, not anything other than a religion in the way that religion is understood in the world today. Now, from my religious standpoint, as a religious Jew, I can say that I consider, Mr. So-and-so, Ms. So-and-so to be Jewish as far as my religion defines the difference between the Jew and the non-Jew. Meaning Judaism defines a Jew, as opposed to a non-Jew, as someone who is obliged in all of the commandments, and the non-Jew as the one who is only obliged in the 7 commandments, if any commandments at all. There is some controversy in the writings of our sages as to whether the 7 commandments still apply today. It's universally accepted that they applied at one point in history. The question is, does the virtue of the fact that the world has mostly ignored those commandments meant that they no longer apply? And what the Talmud comes out to say is that, well, they still apply for punishment, but not necessarily for reward. And for that reason, I encourage anybody who believes Judaism to be the true faith to put at least a consideration into conversion to Judaism at their earliest convenience, because it's, halachically speaking, there is much more to be gained being Jewish than not being Jewish. Not to say that there's any obligation to become Jewish. There is none, but it's definitely better. I don't believe this idea that I used to believe when I was younger, that somehow it's better to keep the 7 laws of Noah and and I don't believe it is. I believe it's better to become Jewish. This is what my Rosh Yeshiva taught, Rosh Lazarus Shlita, and it's what is obvious from Shulchan Aruch, from the Rambam, from Gemara there in Yevamos, where the laws of conversion are discussed. And that being said, the laws of conversion are rather unique, that they're almost totally verbatim from the Gemara to the Rambam to the Shulchan Aruch, whereas most other areas of Jewish law, since they're found in so many different places in the Talmud, yes, what you find in the Rambam and in the Shulchan Aruch are generally quoting from the Talmudic sources, and the Shulchan Aruch is generally pretty similar to the Rambam. But when it comes to conversion, there are only very few minor differences from the Gemara in Yevamos to the Rambam in Hilchos Isserei Bia to Shulchan Aruch in Hilchos Gerim in Yoreh De'ah. Which just interesting to note. I think it's also interesting to note that Hilchos Gerim is in Yoreh De'ah and not in Even HaEzer and not in Choshen Mishpat. And I think the fact of that goes to show that the Shulchan Aruch was not expecting the Dayanim on a Bezdin for Geras to be necessarily Dayanim Mumchim, but really whether it's Gimel Chachomim or Gimel Anoshim, Hedyotos, would seem to be sufficient, depending on the opinion that the Ramos is Chachomim. Shulchan Aruch, which is basing its structure on the Torah, because obviously if it was basing on the Rambam, who has Hilchos Geras and Hilchos Isserei Bia, then it would be in Even HaEzer, most likely. And if it was for Dayanim Mumchim, it would be in Choshen Mishpat, most probably. So, it's not in. I guess maybe the fact that it's not in Orach Chaim shows that it's not for Hedyotos, perhaps, but even so, it's Giras Chal with Hedyotos. But we're going to put that aside for now. That being said, in the context of what we're talking about, converts tend to be much better Jews than born Jews. There's no doubt about that. There are much more better converts than there are good-born Jews. There are not that many good-born Jews. But that being said, my feeling is that for someone to self-identify as Jewish, even though nobody's going to listen to me, it doesn't matter what I say, but I can still say my opinion. For someone to self-identify as Jewish, I believe that a religious approach to Judaism is required. I did not say Orthodox. I said religious. Conservative, Reform, certainly renewal, and even to a certain extent Reconstructionist Judaism are all, to a certain extent, religious approaches to Judaism. It's possible to say that this movement called Humanistic Judaism could be considered religious in some way, covenantal, because it has a belief in ethical humanism. It's not really religious in the classical sense, but it's concerning itself with religious belief to a certain extent, and finding a lot of the trappings of the fellowship of religion in a secular setting. So, and then you have just people who are just Jewish and don't even go to shul on Yom Kippur and don't even light Hanukkah candles, or not too many people like that. Most Jews, at least when it comes to Hanukkah, Yom Kippur, and Pesach, they do something. Might not be proper according to halacha, but that's not my business. That's between them and God. But they usually are observing in some way these days as special days, and usually they observe them in pretty traditional liturgical modes, which in a sense, in my feeling, will quote-unquote save the Jewish soul, to say that, yes, this person has the right to self-identify as Jewish, in my not so humble opinion. Now, and again, I'm not saying every Jew has to be Hasidic, not even every Jew has to be Orthodox, but I do believe that, and as much as I disagree with the Reform, I don't really disagree that much with certain aspects of the conservative movement. Depends what, where, when, who, and how religious they are, or how observant they are, and what they believe. I do believe there are pious conservative Jews, although more and more of them are turning to Orthodoxy just because they're losing their place in the conservative movement. They're not finding that that's the place for them, and so they'll wind up in the, moving toward Orthodoxy just because they don't really fit in the conservative movement. And the irony of the conservative movement is that it's pretty liberal. Jews who are not Orthodox tend to be liberal politically. Not all of them are. There are some politically conservative and Reform Jews, but for the most part, the Orthodox Jews tend to be politically conservative. Then there are politically liberal Orthodox Jews as well, and there are religiously liberal Orthodox Jews. I guess I would be, in my mindset, considered to be somewhat religiously liberal, although in my observance and my personal belief, would be on the conservative side of Orthodoxy, in certain areas. Other areas maybe I'm a little bit more liberal about. this being said, these are things to consider. Excuse me. So the question came about liberal Jews and their belief in God. And so here we'll talk about liberal Jews who are religiously liberal, who tend to be politically liberal, but not necessarily so. That being said, if they're religiously liberal, they're certainly going to be lax in their belief of how God communicates with man. The Orthodox believe that God literally wrote the first 5 books of the Bible, letter for letter. And that's what I believe. And that the rest of the books of the Bible are the Word of God, of what is called the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, basically the Protestant Old Testament, as opposed to the Catholic Old Testament, which has more books that we don't have in our canon. I was discussing with a coworker of mine who was a Catholic deacon. He claims that until a certain time it was in the canon. Really, there wasn't any canon before the time that he's discussing, other than the 5 books of Moses. There was no real clear canon. Obviously there was the law and the prophets that was discussed, but to say that these books were somehow in a canon and then were taken out of the canon. All right. I'm okay. How are you?
Okay?
I'm fine. This guy stopped short. Turning.
I stopped the time I seen you hit the brakes. I cut the wheel. I tried.
Yeah.
You got your phone on you? Don't leave that in there. Get a couple pictures, just the way things are right now, and all right.
Let me find my phone.
I gotta try and find mine.